down into the black pit of unconsciousness. His last memory was that of some small bird wheeling above him against the blue. Then darkness took him. Hearing returned to him first. The sound was confused and chaotic. Court lay motionless, striving to analyze it. As if from a vast distance, he seemed to hear a babble of voices faintly mumbling what sounded like gibberish. Piercing through this was a medley of shrill whistles and siren-like noises that were utterly inexplicable. Then Court opened his eyes, looked straight up at a bare white ceiling. Sunlight made square patterns on it. He could move, he discovered. Without difficulty he sat up, found that he was in one of a row of cots that ran down the length of a long room. He was in a hospital. Court's voice cracked when he cried out. He tried again, but roused only an echo. Wonderingly, he rubbed his chin and gasped in amazement. A beard? He must have been unconscious for 2 weeks at least. He rose, shivering in his regulation hospital nightgown. Though the windows were closed, the room was icy cold. Rocking weakly on his feet, Court looked around. The man in the next bed looked familiar. It was the obese Oriental he had last seen in the golden spaceship. The man lay silent, motionless, no breath lifting his huge paunch. In the cot beyond lay the scar-faced giant, the man who had resembled a gladiator. He, too, was apparently dead or cataleptic. Some of the other beds were occupied, Court saw. He made a quick investigation. Strangers, and dead, all of them. Some had plainly died of starvation and thirst. The blankets in most cases were tumbled and twisted, and some of the bodies on the floor where they had apparently flung themselves. One grizzled oldster was huddled in a heap near the door, his skinny hand still outstretched for aid that could never come. The hospital must have been deserted. But what could have caused medical men to forsake their patients? Physicians do not break the Hippocratic Oath so easily. That meant the plague. His throat tight, Court stumbled to a table where a carafe of water stood. It was stagnant with long standing and half evaporated, but he gulped down a repulsive swallow. A folded newspaper on the table caught his gaze. Hastily, he folded the paper to the first page. Flaring headlines greeted him. Plague strikes New York. 20 carriers reported in Manhattan. Mayor orders city evacuated. Hastily linotyped columns gave the story. All over Greater New York, the plague had suddenly appeared. In Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, from Harlem to the Battery, the shining men, harbingers of weird death, had come into being. Thinking the invasion had arrived by way of Jersey and the surrounding area, the mayor had directed the evacuation to take place northward. But in the box labeled Latest News Bulletins, it became apparent that the infection was spreading with fatal speed. Among 8 millions of people, the plague ran like wildfire. Well, judging by his beard and the date of the paper, that had been 2 weeks ago. What was the country like now? Court went to the window and stared out. The bleak, snow-covered expanse of Central Park was far below. Small, irregular dark blotches lay on the whiteness. Were they bodies? Court found a telephone and jiggled the receiver impatiently. Not even the dial tone answered him. New York must be entirely deserted, save by the dead. Again he went to the window. This time he saw a shining oval of light, dwarfed by distance, gliding under the trees in the park. A carrier. Court knew he could not remain in New York. With a nod of decision, he glanced at the 2 motionless figures on the cots beside his own. Hastily, he began to gather equipment. He saw a use for the Oriental and the giant. He could not leave them here, frozen in cataleptic sleep, even if he did not think that their knowledge might prove valuable. He used heat, stimulants, and artificial respiration. The stimulants were easy to procure after a trip down the corridor into adjoining wards. It was harder to find adrenaline. Court had to break down a door before locating the drug, but finally he was ready. Electricity, rather than gas, supplied the hospital. He knew there would be no current now. Court hesitated. Frowning, he stared out the window. He heard again the distant din that had awakened him, the faint hooting and the low mumble of far voices. Radios, of course. Innumerable radios had been left turned on when the evacuation had taken place, and they were still broadcasting. That meant there was still electricity. Relieved, Court found heating pads and pressed them into place about his two patients. Little artificial respiration was necessary. Under the shock of the adrenaline, first the giant and then the Oriental stirred. They wakened almost together. Court gave a gasp of relief. Till then, he had not realized just how much his fortnight of hypnotized slumber had weakened him. Despite slowed and retarded metabolism, he had not eaten nor drunk for weeks. Shivering, he sank down on a cot and watched his patient slowly and gradually awaken. There was so much to do. He must communicate with these two. But what language did they speak? Would they be able to understand Latin? After that, there would be so many things. Find out what had happened, leave New York safely. But the first thing, Court murmured, is to stow some food under my belt. No, he resolved, glancing down at his nightgown. The first thing I need is a pair of pants. Chapter 15. Under the Plague. It was nearly an hour later when Court finally finished his story and learned from Li Yang and Scipio their own tale. Luckily, both understood Latin. When Court's knowledge of the language failed, he pieced it out in Greek, which Scipio knew. "I am familiar with all the tongues spoken around the Middle Sea, the Mediterranean," the huge Carthaginian stated. "This English of yours sounds like a hybrid language, a mixture of Latin, Greek, Goth, and Zeus knows what else. However, I will learn it. We had a saying that those in Helvetia had best do as the Helvetians do, though all they generally did was freeze." Scipio chuckled deep in his barrel chest. "We have a saying that jackasses bray at inopportune moments," said Li Yang blandly. "Therefore, hold your tongue, Scipio, while we make some plans." He sighed ponderously. "So, Ardath is dead, eh? Eheu, he was a wise man, and a good one. Also, I have lost my lute, so I grieve." "I scarcely knew Ardath," Scipio confessed, "though he saved my life, of course. But the nymph girl, Jansaya, I needed only a glimpse of her to lose my heart and soul." The gargoyle face twisted in pained memory. "What can we best do, Court?" "Get out of New York. After that, we can make our plans. I want to get back to my laboratory. But first, well, come along." Court rose and led the others into the corridor. Li Yang shivered as the chill wind rustled under his scanty gown. "The world has grown colder," he mourned. "Not even on the northern steppes did I feel such a knife-like blast." Court was unavailingly pressing the elevator buttons. "Guess they're not working," he said wryly. "That means we'll have to walk all the way down. It'll keep us warm anyway. Watch out for any carriers." Scipio shook his head as the three hurried down the stairs. "I do not understand this plague. Civilizations change, of course. New gods and new magics spring up. But what you tell me of this plague smacks of the Vrykolokas, the vampire." The others had no breath for talking. Scipio continued to muse aloud as they descended. When they reached the street, though, he was the only one who was not panting. "Zeus, Apollo, Kronos, and Neptune!" he roared, staring up at the skyscrapers. Surely the gods must have reared these buildings." "Did gods build the Nilotic pyramids?" Li Yan asked, with breath